This is the Ricoh GR. It's by far one of my favorite cameras, and in this video I will be sharing with you my setup process to get the most out of this and get up and running as quickly as possible. This is the GR4, however 95% of this video will also apply to the GR3. One important thing to keep in mind is that despite a few best practices, camera setup is incredibly subjective. So what works for me might not necessarily work for you. And the healthiest approach to this video is to listen to what I have to say, give it a go, keep what works, remove what doesn't, and over time that's how you end up with your own camera setup. Now, if you find any of this useful, please check out my Ricoh GR3 and GR4 camera setup guides. They've been painstakingly put together after months of use, and the whole idea of those guides is to get you up and running as quickly as possible. They're not replacements for the user manual, instead they focus on the why, not necessarily the how. They just accompany the user manuals, and together you will get the most out of this. But anyway, that's enough chit chat. Let's get started with custom buttons. To set up the custom buttons, you first go into the menu, then into the customize control and into the FN button setting. So the FN button, I have it set to snap, and when I press this button, it enables snap focusing. I use snap focusing quite a lot, and the FN button is by far the most ergonomic button that you can reach quickly. So set it up to whatever you're gonna use the most on this camera. Snap focusing is a pretty unique feature for this, and it's one that I use a lot, therefore it's set up to the most convenient button for me. Next is the ISO button. So I don't need to adjust the ISO on this camera. It's very much a set and forget kind of setting for me. However, the ND filter is something that I use a lot for slow shutter speed photography. If I want to get some motion blur in my images and I'm shooting during the day, I would need to use the ND. Therefore, it's easily accessible on the back of the camera. Moving down to the drive button, this isn't something that I adjust frequently, just like ISO, so it makes sense to reprogram it to a more useful setting, such as exposure metering. Exposure metering is where you tell the camera how you want it to expose the scene in front of you. It's something that I change quite a lot, but I'll talk more about that in the exposure chapter of the video. Next up is the white balance button. Again, white balance is something that I leave in auto and I seldom ever touch it. However, by reprogramming it to the focus menu, I now have a quick access to the focusing controls, which for me are a lot more useful. We'll cover them in the focusing section of the video later on. And the final button is the movie button on the side of the camera. Now, I have this switched off completely for both the single press and the long press. There isn't anything else on this camera that I need to be triggered quickly. I don't use the movie function of the camera at all. And even if I did assign something to this button, it requires a two-handed operation because of the position of the button. And for me, this camera is a one-handed camera, so I tried a bunch of different things, and honestly, I never ended up using any of them because of the position of the button. So it's easier just to have it off and not worry about it. Now let's have a look at the ADJ mode, which is effectively a quick menu. So I'm not quite sure why it's called that, but if you press the rear thumb dial once, you will bring up this menu that you can navigate and change things quickly. I keep it for items which I might need to change in a rush, and to set this up, you go back into the customize control under the main menu, and just above the FN button setting, you have the ADJ mode setting. So if we open that, there are 5 settings you can choose. I only use 4 of them, I don't need the 5th one. So the first one is set to snap distance, and this allows me to change the distance of the snap focusing. The second one is set to drive mode, so if I want to flick between a single, multiple shots, and also bracketing is quite useful because of dynamic range of the camera. So if I'm shooting a very high contrast scene, bracketing can just give me 3 or 5 different exposures depending on how you set it up. So you can choose later, or you can even blend them. The third setting is touchscreen functionality. Now the touchscreen on this is very useful, but there might be certain scenarios where you don't want it on because you don't want to accidentally move or adjust something. And for that, I will switch it off. I typically shoot 75% with the touchscreen and 25% without, just depending on the situation. And the final setting is the outdoor view setting. So it's basically the brightness of the LCD screen. Because you don't have a viewfinder, you need to see the LCD at all times. Generally, I keep the brightness as high as possible unless I'm shooting at night, because I need to see what I'm composing, and in direct sunlight, it can be a challenge, but if you turn it all the way up, I think it's bright enough where you can get a good idea of what you're taking photos of. Now let's have a look at the top dial, which is the primary way to interact with this camera and change how it shoots and how it behaves. Across the GR3 and the GR4, the top dials are the same. The only slight difference is that on the GR4, you get an extra mode called snap focus mode. And the way it works is, instead of controlling, let's say, the aperture or the shutter speed, instead you control the depth of field and the distance where you want to focus. I've used it. Honestly, it's not for me. I found it a bit gimmicky. Many people might disagree, and that's okay. It's just not my cup of tea. Instead, what I found extremely useful is the P program mode and the 3 custom U modes, so U1, U2, U3. P stands for program, which basically means the camera is in full automatic mode and it decides the aperture, shutter, and ISO. However, there's a big distinction between P and a fully automatic mode. In P, you actually have control over the shutter speed and the ISO, and you can change it. So even though it's in full automatic, if you're shooting, let's say, a moving subject and you want to add some motion blur, you can quickly drop the shutter speed down. The camera will readjust the aperture in order to get the correct exposure. Same for the aperture. And then what you can do is, using the little lock and unlock button right there, if you just push it in once, it will reset the settings back to the automatic ones that the camera thinks you should be using for that particular scene. For me, the P mode is what the GR is all about. It's a point and shoot mode where it's an automatic, but you can quickly override it if you need to without much hassle. And as I've said, maybe this is the mode that I'm in 90% of the time because it just makes sense for this camera. I don't shoot in manual at all. I don't shoot in aperture priority on the AV dial. I use it in the custom modes, but I'll talk about that in a minute. And I don't use the shutter priority either on the dial because, again, I can just change it in the P mode if I need to. Of course, if I need to lock the shutter speed and it's critical for whatever reason, I will switch it to shutter priority mode for that. Now, you have U1, U2, U3. These are the custom modes. So what's the difference? Well, if I make a change in AV, so aperture priority, let's say I change the picture profile. When I go to P, when I go to M or any of the other modes, that change is remembered. Whereas U1, U2, U3 are saved settings, saved entire camera setups to those memory banks. So I can have 3 different camera setups that are individually remembered. So if I make a change in U1, if I go to U2 and then go back to U1, that change then resets to whatever I saved it to. So if you have certain camera presets that you always keep going back to and you don't want to mess up, that's what I would save to U1, U2, and U3. How I use it is maybe not common, but I'm not sure, you let me know. But I have all 3 modes set up identically to aperture priority mode, apart from one difference. U1 uses an f2.8 aperture, U2 uses an f5.6 aperture, and U3 uses an f11 aperture. So when I'm shooting in aperture priority mode, I am very much focused on photography. This is, okay, I really want to get good shots. I am in my zone, I'm focused. When I'm shooting in P mode is I'm out with my missus, with mum, with my friends. I'm just doing random snapshots of my lunch. Photography is not priority. But when photography is a priority, that's where depth of field for me becomes very important, because it changes what your photo is all about. And rather than using the top dial and then forgetting what aperture value I'm in, instead I'm just using these 3 settings. So I will typically start in U2, which is f5.6 on a sunny day. And then if I know I need to get more in focus and get the whole scene, I'll just quickly flick to f11. If I want to isolate my subject, I will then quickly flick to f2.8. By having it set up in this way, I know exactly what aperture value I'm using, and I know that the rest of the camera is set up exactly the same. So for how I shoot, it works. For you, it might be different. If you are a shutter priority photographer, you can do this, but with 3 different shutter speeds. If you shoot JPEGs and you use different picture profiles, this can have, let's say, black and white, vibrant, and a filmic look. If you use different focus modes, you can have, or different exposure modes, you can have it set accordingly. You can have whatever you want here. The aperture priority is or the aperture value is what works for me, but by all means play around and yeah, you'll figure out what works for you. Now, before setting these custom modes up, I highly suggest you first set up the whole camera, either from this video yourself or from my guides, because once you've saved that setting, if you make any other changes, you have to go back and resave it again. Once or twice, it's not a problem, but trust me from experience, if you have to do that 10 times because you forgot to update something, it becomes very annoying. So if you want, let's say U1 to be aperture priority, you first set the camera to AV, you then set up the whole camera as you see fit, you then head into menu, you go down to customize control, and under assign user mode dial, you click on that, you assign which dial you want, you change the name if you need to, press OK, and now that U1 or U2 or whatever you've assigned is set up exactly how you've set up the camera before. Now let's talk about RAW versus JPEG, because this is something that I know will come up in the comments if I don't mention it. Everyone is different. However, for me, RAW photography always takes priority, and I don't shoot in JPEG, whether it's on the Ricoh, whether it's on the Fuji or any other camera, even on my iPhone, I don't use JPEGs. The primary reason for that is because the edit is just as much of your personal stamp on the image as the composition, the lighting, and the subject you choose. So for me to hand over such a large part of the workflow of the creative process to the camera just doesn't make sense. Now, I happen to really enjoy editing, so I could quite easily spend a whole evening on the sofa tweaking the photos. Now, for many people, they don't like editing, they don't have the time to edit, or they really like the custom looks that come with their camera. Now, with the Ricoh, I am not an expert on the JPEG settings. This is something that I might learn in the future, and then if I do, then there would be a free update to the guide, plus probably a blog on it as well. But as it stands, I only shoot RAW because for me, it's important to be able to edit my photos and put my own stamp on them. So yeah. Now let's talk about exposure. So assuming you'll be shooting in aperture priority, shutter priority, or program, you have control over some of the parameters, but not all of them. And there are 3 key, let's say, criteria for your exposure. The first one is the general exposure compensation. The second one is exposure metering, and the third one is auto ISO settings. So the general exposure is the exposure compensation that you've seen on all cameras, where you can add or take away 0.3, 0.6, 1, if not more, on the exposure value, so you overexpose or underexpose the photo. On this particular camera, I would say pay closer attention to that, simply because you just don't have the dynamic range that you might have on a bigger camera with a bigger sensor. There is still a lot of dynamic range, but it's just something to keep in mind, especially if you're shooting in JPEG. In the RAW, you have a lot more room to recover, your highlights and your shadows, but in JPEG you really have to dial it in. For me, if I'm shooting on a bright sunny day, I tend to slightly underexpose by -0.3 just to protect the extreme highlights. If I'm shooting on a cloudy day, I would actually overexpose by 0.3 or 0.6 even, simply because I don't really care about the sky on a dull cloudy day. However, I want to retain as much information in the shadows as possible. If I'm shooting in low light, I will actually underexpose, which I know is a bit counterintuitive, but when you're shooting at night, underexposing preserves all the highlights, which are very easy to blow out. And typically, in my experience, cameras overexpose night scenes anyway. So if you leave your camera in 0 exposure comp, compare it to real life will probably be a little bit darker. And if I'm shooting fog, snow, I can overexpose by even +0.6, +1, because cameras always underexpose fog and snow, because to them they just see white and bright and they don't know that it's fog and snow, so they bring that exposure down. Now let's look at auto exposure metering. So auto exposure metering is where you tell the camera how to interpret what it's looking at. So multi-exposure is where the camera looks at the whole scene and it says, okay, based on this whole scene, the sky, the buildings, the trees, all of that, this is the correct exposure. Now this is the mode that I'm in 90% of the time, because on the Ricoh I find this mode to be incredibly accurate and I never have to deal with too many issues. However, if you're shooting out of a window, the camera can sometimes overexpose the window frame and what's inside the building, therefore blowing out what's on the outside. This is where the center metering mode comes in useful, because you're telling the camera, do your exposure thing, but only in the middle part of the frame. Next, you have spot metering. I don't use this on this camera, but it's basically you have a tiny little spot, a square, and then whatever that lands on is what gets metered. It creates the most extreme changes in exposure, and on this camera, I think it's not necessary, because you have highlight metering mode, which is the last one, and it meters based on the highlights. So it ensures that no highlights are blown out, and it's the quickest and the easiest way to create that high contrast highlight and shadow look that you've probably seen on Instagram. So if that's the look you're going for, use highlight metering. If you want to protect the highlights at all costs, use highlight metering. Just be aware that it can create some drastically underexposed photos. And also, if you're shooting a highlight that is extremely bright and is pretty much blown out to your eyes anyway, I would argue that a multi-mode might be more suitable, because your camera will try to expose something that even your eyes can't, and then you might get a, that HDR or slightly unnatural looking image. But play around with them, see what works for you. If you're not sure, start in multi and then go from there. And the final piece of the puzzle when it comes to auto exposure is making sure you have your correct ISO and minimum shutter settings. Whenever you bought a camera, if you didn't set this up, you might encounter issues when shooting in low light, because the camera will be forcing that shutter speed as low as possible in order to get a low ISO and the cleanest possible image. However, in my opinion, that can create more problems. So to fix that, we first go into the menu system, and then we go into the still image setting, and then head down all the way to ISO setting. So ISO setting is set to auto, because obviously we're using auto ISO. ISO upper limit. So on the GR3, I was using 6400, but on this one with a newer sensor that's a bit better in low light, I'm using 12,800. I think it's the maximum where you can still get away with good results with a bit of post-processing. Any more than that, I just wouldn't bother on this, but 12,800 is a pretty high ISO already. The lower limit is 100. There's just no need to shoot with a higher lower limit. Of course, some unique scenarios might require it, but for the type of photography that you'll be doing on this camera, 100 is perfect, and the camera will try to stay as close to 100 as possible to keep the cleanest image. And then the minimum shutter speed is basically where you're telling the camera, do not go below this number because that's the minimum. So on the GR, which is the wider angle camera, I'm using 1/160 because it's so wide, any image shake isn't as noticeable. However, if you have a GR3X, because the X version of this is not released yet, I would increase that to maybe 1/200, but it also depends on how shaky or stable your hand is. 1/160 for me though is perfectly fine. The only thing to keep in mind, and for some reason most cameras do it, in extreme cases when the camera is really pushed, it can drop below that minimum. Don't rely on 1/160 on this auto ISO setting. Instead, if you need a precise shutter speed, just shoot in shutter priority. This is more of a guide when shooting in good lighting conditions. But yeah, if your camera's being pushed, if you're shooting in a dark street, just go to shutter speed priority and that will be secure in terms of keeping that shutter speed. I only use two focus modes. The first one is called Zone Select AF. You get a pretty large square, and I use that mode if I am doing general snapshotting, cityscapes, landscapes, anywhere where there's a very large area and precise focus isn't required. The other focus mode will be Select AF. It's a slightly smaller square, and that is more precise. It's also a little bit quicker in my opinion. That's what I'm usually using like 80-90% of the time, and for me it's very accurate. There are a few things in this camera which I don't like about the focusing, and I don't use them. So the face tracking and the continuous autofocus, I find both to be rather unreliable for how I shoot. You know, for you it might be different, but I just don't find the results from that to be as accurate. So I use single autofocus so the camera doesn't track and change the settings, the focus when you change. So you half press the shutter, it locks, you take a picture, and then you can carry on. And then I'll flick between the select and the zone depending on what I'm shooting. And last but not least, we have snap focus. So in terms of the snap focus distances, this depends again on what you're trying to do. I typically work with two different distances. The first one is infinity, and infinity is basically the camera will focus on the furthest object right in the distance, and as long as you're shooting above like f4 or even at f2.8, to be honest, you're gonna get the background in focus and everything else that comes forward will be out of focus depending how close it is to the camera. And that is the mode that I would typically use if I want to focus on the background but then shoot through things. So let's say I want to focus on the city and then people are walking through the scene. I don't want the camera to focus on them. Instead, I want the focus to be maintained on the city. This is a good way of doing it. Another distance I will choose is around 2.5 meters, and that is for street photography. So if I'm shooting at f11, I'll set it to 2.5, and then I know that roughly everything kind of in front of me backwards will be perfectly in focus, and that's great for kind of spray and pray style for photography when you want to get the whole scene in focus. But of course, you can adjust it to whatever you want. 2.5, 2, and infinity is what works for me. Now let me mention a few menu items which I feel are important and they can make or break your photography experience. The first one is called full press snap. So with normal focusing, you half press, it locks, you fully press, the photo is taken, okay? If you press the whole button once all the way through, then the camera will first try to focus and then take the photo, so there might be a bit of a delay. Full press snap means that if you do that, so you press straight through the first bit and then all the way down, instead of acquiring focus, the camera will instantly go to the preset snap distance and take a photo at that distance. For me, if I'm sometimes, trigger happy, I can accidentally do that and then get a completely out of focus image. So if I want to use snap focusing, I'd rather just enable it using the FN button. And with this, I'd rather not play with fire, so I have it switched off. That way I know that if I accidentally go all the way through, the camera will try to focus on whatever it is I'm pointing at, and it's not going to just go straight into snap focusing. If you're like me and you're only going to be shooting in RAW, I highly suggest switching off all of the JPEG features, such as the dynamic range correction and noise reduction. Even though I can't say for sure on this camera whether they impact the RAW files, I know on some other brands like on the Fujis, the dynamic range can definitely have an impact because a higher dynamic range will usually require a higher base ISO, so you'll be using features which you don't really need because you're shooting in RAW. So by having all JPEG settings, all noise reduction, all sharpness, all of that switched off, you're guaranteed to get the most raw file without any camera intervention. When it comes to the shutter button, I have it set to both AF and AE lock, meaning when you half press the shutter, the focusing and the exposure are locked. So this is a very easy way to focus, expose, and then recompose on the scene afterwards. And I use this all the time. I will focus maybe on a brighter part of the scene, recompose in order to get a higher contrast image, or focus on the background, quickly recompose, shoot through something. I find that very intuitive. Moving on, this setting can also catch some people out, and it's called link AE and AF points. What that means is that if that is switched on, the camera will expose from the focus point and not from the whole scene. In some cases, you might want that. So if you want to do more specific exposure adjustments, which you don't want to do in manual mode, you can link them together. But in most cases, I find it to be extremely distracting and confusing. So I have it switched off, and therefore the metering is done from the whole scene, and then the actual focus point remains only for focusing. And if I want to focus on that specific area where the focus point is, I can adjust the metering mode to, let's say, highlight priority or whatever, or I can even recompose the camera, focus, lock the exposure, lock the focus, and then I'm good to go. And the final critical setting that can make or break your photography is making sure that all the lights and the sounds from the camera are switched off. You don't want the camera to be going beep beep when you focus, because everyone's going to look at you, and there is absolutely no point in that sound unless you're maybe visually impaired and you need that to get confirmation. Then it makes total sense, but other than that, it's pointless. Same with fake shutter sounds, all of that. If you're into that, cool, but for me, it attracts attention. It doesn't particularly sound great. So yeah, all of that is switched off. Same goes for any focus assist lights. Now I still have the on and off little green light, but you can't see it really, and it looks quite cool. But that bright red focus assist light, have that firmly switched off. It's pointless. All right, well, that's all for this video. I hope you found this useful. If you have any specific questions, please write them down below. And of course, if you want to support this channel, do have a look at the camera guides. But other than that, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye for now. At this point, I want to quickly thank Squarespace for sponsoring this video. I've been a paying customer way before they supported the channel, and have now been using their services for over 5 years. Squarespace is at the center of my online presence, and it's what drives my blog, portfolio, store, and newsletter. I appreciate the simplicity of managing everything from a single app because it saves me time and gives me peace of mind knowing that I can make changes or deal with issues from my phone. If you have a business, a side hustle, or simply want your own little corner of the internet to host your photography or build something big, Squarespace offers all the tools you need across all devices. If you want to learn more, get a free trial and then 10% off your first purchase, use the link in the description or enter code RomanFox at checkout. Thank you again to Squarespace for sponsoring, and thank you for watching.